we have fascinating set of skill sets amongst our panelists, actually. I'm going to introduce them very briefly, but they may want to add something themselves. Only one of them calls himself a trade policy analyst, but we have a lot of engineers. I actually think it's the engineers that make everything work in the world. We have electrical and IT engineering skills, civil engineering skills, industrial engineering, chemical engineering. On these panels today, we have a data science. Now, science and engineering has a strong focus on evidence-based experimentation. And we hear a lot also from business about the importance of soft skills, human-centric social skills. So I expect all our scientists and engineers today to bring those skills to bear, especially their communication skills. So here goes. I open session 1, services transformation and the future of work. Our 3 panelists are Janos Ferencz. He's the trade policy analyst, trade and services division at the OECD Trade Directorate, based in Paris. We then have Dr. David Hardoon, Chief Innovation Officer, Aboitiz Data Innovation, based in Singapore. And we have Adam Bregu. Adam is Director for Business Development and Partnerships of Startup Genome. This is a US company. Adam himself is based in Berlin. So Janos, I move straight to you to start our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Jane. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all participants. And thank you also to the organizers for the invitation. Let me jump right to it. I want to talk about 3 things today. First, I want to talk about employment in services and how digitalization is changing the scope and means of work. Secondly, I want to touch on the importance of trade policies that enable the movement of people, talent, and skills across borders. And lastly, I would like to touch on a specific new technology that is related to this domain, and notably that's artificial intelligence. So let me start with the first point. As Jane, you also highlighted, a large share of employment currently is in services. In fact, if you look at the global overview, over half of all jobs worldwide are now in services. And in many countries, this goes up to 60 or 70%. And importantly, this share has been growing over the past years. A growing number of empirical evidence also demonstrates that services firms that engage in trade offer more jobs and pay better wages. With the digital transformation and new technologies, we also see a considerable change or reshaping of the nature of work, as well as how we work and where we work. New communication technologies, better ICT equipment, and faster internet connectivity allowed many of us to continue our jobs at home during the COVID-19 pandemic, but not everyone has this option. So jobs that require access to more physical components are more likely to be held by lower skilled workers, for instance, in retail or manufacturing or transport sectors. So it's very important that education and labor strategies adopted at a domestic level take into account this growing shift towards a services-driven digital economy. And this, unfortunately, is not always the case. And this points to the need for policymakers to provide the necessary tools for people to upgrade their skills or acquire new competencies. Turning to my second point, the policy and regulatory environment play a crucial role in enabling the creation of new digital businesses or facilitate the growth of existing ones. And business growth means job growth. So particularly this is true when we look at SMEs, which are an important engine of new jobs. Importantly, the mobility of persons across international borders is also a crucial factor, particularly for trade in business services, which is, as we know, a very important channel for knowledge transfer. However, what the current evidence tells us is that regulatory barriers affecting the movement of people are very high across the globe, including in the APEC region. For instance, limiting the number of foreign workers or limiting the scope of what they can do really deprives services firms from valuable talents that could undermine, at the end, their overall competitiveness on global markets. APEC leaders have recognized the importance of this area and adopted some mechanisms to promote, for instance, visas for business visitors in the APEC region. However, more could be done and more needs to be done to address the challenges faced by professionals, including addressing challenges related to licenses, qualifications, standards, and mutual recognition mechanisms. My third point, I would like to speak a bit about artificial intelligence, or AI. This is a very exciting new technology that has tremendous potential to change international trade by enabling greater productivity, contributing to better supply chain management, lowering trade costs, and also enabling new types of services that build on processing large volumes of data. And AI also has the potential to complement human capabilities. So policymakers really have an important role when it comes to helping workers upskill in order to adapt to these changes in labor demands. I would also like to point out that international cooperation on core principles governing the use and deployment of AI is a very important way to maintain a human-focused and values-based approach towards the development and deployment of artificial intelligence. So let me conclude my initial thoughts with two suggestions or recommendations. First, I think upgrading skills and adapting them to the requirements of a services-based digital economy should be a policy priority in APEC, and it should be a policy priority globally. Such policies could be related to improving skills or putting in place labor market policies that promote the inclusion of women, enhance matching between employers and employees, aim at reducing the negative effects on displaced workers, and also on workers that experience reductions in wages. There's also a need for more cooperation, both regionally and internationally, to identify best practices and common solutions. And because trade is a conduit for the transfer of skills, human expertise, and knowledge, lowering barriers remains as important as ever, especially regarding barriers on the movement of people. APEC and the business community, so ABAC, also provides an excellent forum to exchange on this, and I look forward to seeing APEC leadership in taking this issue forward. Thank you very much. Back to you, Jane.
Thank you very much, Janos, and a very a wonderful way to start with a reminder that the barriers to people movement in the region are still very high, and that this undermines competitiveness, including in digital services, mustn't be allowed to fall off the agenda of the competitiveness roadmap implementation process. So thank you very much. I'm glad this has been recorded, because you had some very concrete suggestions there for what APEC should do, and we will capture those. Thank you very much. I'm going to move straight on to Dr. David Hardoon, and we'll then have some time for interaction between all three panelists at the end. Thank you. So over to you, David.
Thank you very much, Jane, and equally good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. It feels like a bit like a Truman Show for everyone being here. It's actually a pleasure talking about this underlying topic. Now, before I lunge in, and similarly with a few minutes that I have talking about the technological transformation and borderline revolution that we're experiencing, I actually want to take a step back first and rekindle the fact that the vast majority of the technology which we're now experiencing, both within our own organizations or across border perspective, is not new. So what's different? What has changed? it essentially the congregation and the coming together of that mutualizations of technologies in terms of social, in terms of cloud capabilities, in terms of AI. It is each one of these that have come together to really facilitate this underlying transformation and eruption, effectively, that we're all experiencing. And I want to emphasize that particular point because at times people ask themselves, well, what's different? Well, this is what's different, is this combination of elements that are coming together. And I think that is a particular point that I want to emphasize of the coming together that really allows an exponential benefit technologically and equally that we can achieve from. Furthermore, I want to emphasize with respect to this experience that we're all going through from technological transformation. And I was kind of half in mind to whether to quote Winston Churchill when he said that never let a good crisis go to waste. And I was kind of contemplating whether good should be really the focus. I would just say never let a crisis go to waste. And in terms that this acceleration has been in conjunction with these recent crises, health crisis, ESG challenges, won't call it a crisis, but a challenges, and how do we adhere to them, climate change and so forth. And at every single one of these points, one of these kind of convex situations, what we're really seeing is this transformation and this boom. Again, not necessarily with respect to the technology, not necessarily about the adoption. You're seeing the adoption, but the technology itself has been there. We're seeing that underlying change in us, in the people, in the HI, which I really love, by the way, Jane, the human intelligence of how do we go about using this underlying technology in its existing fashion within an organization or beyond, or in a fundamentally new one that we experience from an exponential perspective. So the focus is very much so, and I believe the second session will go into a lot more details, in a constant upskilling of people. In fact, that is, if I kind of risk at that cliche, that is the new constant, the continuous change and training and upskilling of people in terms of how do we make sure that that is the ability to adapt and incorporate the availability of technology that is there or coming at the point of crisis, or dare I say, even before then. And then essentially thriving and being sustainable in this kind of digital environment that we are in effectively. So furthermore, and beyond, I think, upskilling, because that is an important, a critically important element, but beyond that is that upskilling is not enough. That these should be supplemented with programs with respect to overall culture and mindset within an organization. Now, many times people talk about a data culture or data mindset. I will slightly refute that point, where it's essentially more about how do we incorporate data into the organization's culture? How do we incorporate data, AI, technology into the mindset of the culture? And then you see that transformation with respect to those 2 points happening organically. But this doesn't happen without the right nudge, doesn't happen without preemptive planning effectively, which is critical. I've heard this multiple times in various formats, that it's never about technology. It is about the capacity and the will in terms of adopting it, not just utilizing it. If I dive even deeper to that, within this kind of adoption from a cultural and mindset perspective, is data-driven thinking and an innovative mindset is critically important to having the ability to respond to the business requirements, environmental and social, as well as government's challenges. Let's remember that that is also an important element, that the two come hand in hand in unlocking the new opportunities within the industry as well as across the underlying industries. And again, going back to my earlier remark with respect to what has changed, primarily it is the coming together of those technologies. It means that the barrier to entry is exceedingly lower. Nowadays, when you're sitting down and you think, oh, we could do this better, previously there was a certain litmus test that one had to pass in order to do it. Now, anyone can. And we're seeing that reality on the ground, from the crunch and workforce and in restaurants to having applications, digital means in terms of assuring there's still that ability and interaction and serve effectively. Additionally, what's critical is kind of leveraging and operationalizing advanced technologies. And there were earlier remarks mentioned by Janos with respect to data science and AI. And then the criticality about that is, how do we go to that next level of deriving intelligence to augment our intelligence and our processes from end to end, moving away from the mindset of experimentation and innovation from the research-centric point of view to an end-to-end application, to the deployment of it, be it on the front office, middle office, or the back office. And in each one of these areas, the benefits that come from it. This is what needs to be done and must be part of the future of work effectively. So it essentially the combination and the criticality of creating a community, an environment of experimentation, and facilitating from a cultural or comfort point of view, from a upskilling perspective, and facilitating the approach of leveraging on this revolution, if I dare say, the transformation, the technology availability, together, again, with the human capital and talent, to result and lead towards the successful organizations within the development of an industry or cross industries. The operationalization of disruptive technologies such as data science and AI to explore those opportunities and introduce new out-of-the-box ideas. And I will end with this point, challenging the status quo.
David, thank you. I'm very happy to call it a revolution. I think that's the right word to use. And sometimes we use it and sometimes we hesitate, but we are in the midst of the third industrial revolution, and we shouldn't pretend that we're not. You, like Janos, emphasize some of the cultural aspects here, organizational cultural aspects, and drew attention to the fact that you actually do need some preemptive planning before a new innovation mindset becomes organic. And I think that's an interesting message for all organizations, but I'm actually also really pleased that you focused on how new technologies are enabling end-to-end applications across front, middle, and back office, and that the future of work is going to be all tied up in that. I find that end-to-end integration fascinating, because it implies that innovation and value addition can happen at any and all points in that value chain, and much more rapidly. It also means perhaps we'll see improved linkage points across international services value chains, which takes us, of course, into the realm of trade policy, where global services value chains are at last beginning to be understood. We might come back to some of those issues. I might ask Janos even to comment on some of that. But David, I'm very keen to come back and ask you a bit more about data science, but I think I want to move to Adam Bregu, partly because your recommendations suggested that we need to create a community of innovators, that this has to be part of a new culture. And I think Adam is going to talk about precisely that topic. And so let me introduce Adam and suggest that you take over from here. Adam, I know you have a PowerPoint presentation to share with us. Our time is getting tight, but I know you'll stick with the time. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jane. I'm just sharing my screen here. Fantastic. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to all the organizers and participants. My name is Adam Bregu, Director of Startup Genome. I'm very much looking forward to diving deep into today's topic of skills and services for the 21st century and discuss how startup ecosystems are a global key stakeholder. About us, we're an innovation policy and advisory firm. We work with more than 125 governments, innovation agencies globally. Started in 2012, as Jay mentioned, headquartered in San Francisco. I'm based here in Berlin. Our mission is to accelerate the growth of startup ecosystems so every city and every jurisdiction captures its fair share of the new economy, including economic value and jobs. We support ecosystems at all stages and sizes. A very big ethos of ours is two-way learning from who we work with. We very much believe that the bigger we has the answers to fostering high-performing, inclusive startup ecosystems, especially when it comes to such topics as skills and talent. A few key definitions before I move on. We utilize the definition of a startup, Steve Blank's definition, a temporary organization designed to search for a repeatable and scalable business model. A startup ecosystem, a cluster of startups and related entities that draw from a shared pool of resources and generally reside within a 60-mile radius. Ecosystem value, the value of exits and startup valuations, and the deep tech sector, advanced manufacturing, robotics, AMR, ag tech, and new food, and others. The global startup ecosystem value of the market is an incredible US $6.4 trillion. This is an enormous increase from only 2 trillion, from only 3.8 trillion only 2 years ago. Amongst many factors, this increase in value is fueled by the people, the talent that enabled this to happen. The global startup revolution is disrupting industry after industry and is growing at more than 10% a year. They're growing at 3x to 4x the normal growth rate of our economies. Within 20 years, tech will become the largest single sector of the world's economy. Today, startups are thriving all around the world, but value is still extremely concentrated to only the top 10 locations. Currently, 63% of all value is concentrated in the top 10 locations, although this is down from 87% in 2011 to 2021. Our mission is to flatten the curve, to work together so that more economies can capture a greater share of economic value, jobs, and social inclusion. A trend that is showcased in this is happening is the increasing amount of ecosystems that have produced at least one unicorn in scale-ups. Examples very recently, including Santiago, Chile with Notco, and Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam with Sky Mavis and Momo. More and more tech talents and new skill jobs are needed to fuel these in all ecosystems around the world. Why do startups and startup ecosystems matter? Startups bring ideas to life and fuel economic growth and job creation. A key question we have been researching over the past 10 years is how can you build strong, sustainable startup ecosystems? This model on the screen looks at how we can do this. And today we'll dive into a couple of the factors that most directly relate to skills and services for the 21st century, which is talent and funding. From studying dynamics of successful startup ecosystems, we have learned that what we do together is more important than what we do alone. Today, we will cover a couple of impactful recommendations to improve talent development that can close the skills gap to help economies to adapt and optimize gains from the evolving nature of work. We will dive into recommendations of having an aligned ecosystem, including examples from Tel Aviv and Amsterdam, recommendations as well on the important factor of supporting founders and tech talent diversity through acceleration programs and funding programs, looking at impactful examples in Melbourne, Australia. On the map, you can see other topics that include supporting Indigenous and minority founders, supporting women to enter tech and stay in tech, and the importance of a keystone team as well. The first impactful recommendation is the important aspect of an aligned ecosystem of public and private players to address high-tech human capital challenges. This gap is addressing and solving a shortage of the shortage of tech professionals, a mismatch typically between training and industry, and enabling SMEs to attract and keep IT specialists. The best practice comes from Amsterdam, from Startup Amsterdam, a government initiative from the City of Amsterdam, and Tech Connect, a non-for-profit by the Amsterdam Economic Board, Dutch corporations, as well as unicorns, including Booking.com and TomTom. This public-private initiative, chaired by the City of Amsterdam, its sole focus is a keystone entity, which is to create more connections within the local startup ecosystem. A key pillar is ensuring that this happens is making an abundance of tech talent available in the ecosystem. It first does this by quantifying the tech talent needs and funding with all stakeholders. One key program to practically support this talent development is Tech Connect, a training program that congregates the ecosystem stakeholders to supply training programs to people in Amsterdam. A huge part of this success is the easy market entry for corporations, unicorns, universities, and government entities to support and partner on this. A second impactful recommendation is supporting diverse founders and tech talent diversity through acceleration programs and funding programs. This gap is addressing creating a culture of more funding and jobs for women and minority groups in tech. I very much resonated with David's point on the aspect of creating a culture, and the mindset is absolutely integral in developing sustainable startup ecosystems. This best practice comes from talented programs and funding from LaunchVic, the state government innovation agency in Victoria, in Australia. LaunchVic has taken a data-driven approach to understanding gaps in talent development and funding for minorities. This includes 12 pre-accelerator programs to support founders that include diversity targets in all the work that they do, which is integral in their success, as well as 2 focused on women only and 3 regional programs. Their 19 accelerators has supported more than 700 startups grow. Investing in women-founded startups is another incredibly important aspect in terms of sustainable startup ecosystem and talent development. The program that they have successfully run is a $10 million angel sidecar fund. It will unlock close to $40 million for women founders by 2024. This program creates a greater culture of hiring and supporting women founders and tech talent. Just looking at this, a couple of the numbers in terms of the startup ecosystem and job growth success in terms of the phase of startups. 45% of jobs are in startups from 2 to 50 employees. 38% of jobs are in scale-ups from 51 to 500, and 17 are in unicorns with 500 plus employees. Having a strong, sustainable funding at all levels provides a regular flow of startup growth and therefore job growth. Looking deeper in the data, it is incredibly interesting to see the figures that startups add jobs faster, but are adding faster than in the conventional industries. As we can see in terms of finance and insurance, 66.3%, yet an increase of fintech is 13.7%. Professional, scientific and technical services, 3.2%, whilst legal tech, 20%, and enterprise software, 9.4%. As well as the important sectors of deep tech, for example, in manufacturing, which is an increase of 1.4%, and semiconductors plus 10%, and robotics 10%. One very important point to note from our research over the 10 years is that creating leading products, business models, and technologies requires to be globally connected. This also applies to being proactively understanding what the tech trends are and therefore what the jobs of the future are, and to plan and build these skill sets into economies. The continued rise of deep tech is an incredible, importantly, trend that is leading the startup growth and startup ecosystem growth over the past 5 years. Deep tech has been growing its share in technology startups and startup ecosystem from 25% in 2012 to more than 40% in 2021 in both the count and the amount of funding. This graph shows the global startup ecosystem, tech and life sciences subsectors and their growth and rates of maturity. As you can see on the right-hand side, deep tech sectors capture all the spots at the top of the right-hand corner, including advanced manufacturing, robotics, agtech, new food, AI, and big data, which have the highest growth over the past 5 years and showing the importance of digitalization. These subsectors are driving the largest job growth and economic growth within startup ecosystems. This can be insightful, hopefully, in proactively planning for new skill sets and tech talent. Thank you very much for all the organizing participants. It's a pleasure to be here. I hope that some of these insights fuel the conversation on this very important topic of skills services for the 21st century and the future of work. Beyond today's session, please do feel free to reach out to me, and very much looking forward to the conversation. Thank you very much, Jane, and everyone.
Thank you, Adam. Well, we often hear this recommendation from business that governments need to engage in building collaborative, entrepreneurial innovation ecosystems, but we don't always know exactly what that means. And I think, Adam, you've explained to us exactly what it means, and not only that, but how to go about doing it with a lot of best practice examples there. So thank you very much. I'm going to first put you on notice for a question I'll ask in a minute, but I'm going to go back to David for a moment first. But I will come back to you, Adam. I want to know, drawing on all of those many examples, how do you build a really successful model for tech upskilling that has real impact? I mean, if your advice to a government setting up a new skills strategy, what what's the key? How do you make it really work? Now, David, what I'm interested, if I can just start with you, but I expect Janos and Adam both to come in really. I've always wanted to understand what a data scientist is, I guess, and what sort of skills you've developed and how you actually apply them in your daily work, and how you think your job might change by, say, 2030, and what kind of learning you're going to have to do to stay on top of things. And I really want to tease you out as you explain to us, what a data scientist does. If you can comment, this is a hard question, David, but Janos talked about the barriers that are out there. And he talked about the barriers to people movement. And I'm wondering if you might like to comment on barriers to data movement. I mean, your key daily working resource is data, right? So perhaps does privacy regulation impact on your work? Does cybersecurity impact on your work? Does data storage or processing localization affect your work? Or does conditional data flow affect your work? I mean, I would call all of those barriers. And therefore part of our APEC trade policy agenda. So as you explain to us what you do, I thought you might like to answer that question.
No, thank you very much, Jane. I'm smiling cheek to cheek because I think defining what a data scientist does is a bit like capturing a unicorn. It's left for many debates. But putting jokes aside, it's actually a lot of things. I'll be very honest with you. This is kind of a lot of times when I talk about data science, I kind of do my best to anchor it that it's not a one thing. It is a spectrum. It's a spectrum that goes from the traditional world of IT and technology that we know and love to the traditional world of business. But it's everything in between. And by the way, this is also one of the exact reasons why even the simple question of where do you put data? Do you put it in IT organization? Do you put it in the business organization? Do you put it in the operation? Notice that constantly revolves, because in the end of the day, and I half joke by always saying that data science and data is the jam in the sandwich that makes the wholesome goodness. It has to be everything. It has to have that ability of understanding the business lingo, understanding the business objectives, and translating that into at the risk of being a bit of a geek, a scientific approach, which is then based on technology from an implementation perspective. But then equally, taking that technological approach through a scientific solution, but explaining it in very succinct business terms as to why this is important. In fact, that was my inauguration, when I moved from the world of academia to industry. I learned very quickly not to explain the process of optimization in its scientific forms, but the business value associated. So that is really what a data science does across that spectrum. I mean, we can go to the technical elements, but that's really, really, really what they do. Understand the business, translate it to a process, translate it to an application, using all those wonderful methodologies of machine learning and AI, and vice versa. Now, on to your second part of the question about the barriers. I'll be honest with you that that's also how I used to approach it, in terms of viewing it as these are barriers and it's preventing us from doing things. But I think the period that I had the pleasure of working within a regulator made me come to the realization is that, in fact, that is how we should not be approaching it and how we should not be seeing it, because we're starting from a very compliance, no type of approach and then trying to run around it. It's the realization of that actually, and again, I'm saying this loosely, everything is almost possible, but it is how we do it in a manner that that security, privacy, governance, control, in other words, that we're preventing from bad things from happening, are baked at the core of it. And when you take this perspective and approach of we can do it, how do we make sure we do it appropriately, you suddenly realize that things such as cross-border data, not just cross-border in terms of a geographical context, but also across industry, suddenly becomes a lot more feasible, whereas previously the instinctive response, and understandably the instinctive response of like, oh, but there's data privacy. The reality today, and again, I will go back to one of my first comments, because I really want to anchor that a lot of the technology that we're using today has been around for decades. And a lot of technology that we are not using is also already around. And privacy enhancing technology, privacy preserving technology, and so forth is available, whereby we are able to come together, mutualize products and services using from the more rudimentary to the more sophisticated data solutions, so basic stuff all the way to AI, without putting privacy at a risk. So that's really, really, really how I personally view it, and how I would advocate it, is that start with what is that we want, the realization that technology is there, that the capabilities and approaches, but then most importantly, and going back to the definition of a data scientist, we don't do data for the sake of data. We don't do AI for the sake of AI. We don't do innovation for the sake of innovation. We're doing it for a reason, for a purpose, for an objective that the business has put in front of it, or for the consumers that are expecting or adhering to, or internal consumers, our own employees. In fact, if we listen to our employees, there are tremendous means of opportunities from operational efficiency, improvements, or new products. And that goes back to the point of creating a culture of experimentation. Having those innovators, the community of innovators, isn't that like data scientists sometimes are seen like this select few who, hide in a closed room with cloaks on, but no, it's to have few who are driving that agenda for everyone. That's how I'll go about defining it.
That's a terrific definition. Thank you. And I can identify with that. I think we all can, because we might not be scientists engaged in the process of translating technical scientific terms into business terms, but most of us are in fora like this engaged in some kind of translation. Janos's bread and butter is translating technical economic terms into policy language, and that's its own science, I guess, if you like. I'm going to actually, before we go back to Adam, I'm going to ask Janos to comment on what you've said, because regulatory compliance costs is precisely his field, how to bring them down, how to measure them. And I loved your approach to it, which is just don't start with a compliance perspective, just start with a can-do approach and get on with it. And I really like that way of cutting business transaction costs, David. But Janos, over to you, because I think this is a good segue into some of your work.
Thank you, Jane. Exactly. So I think David made a very good point there. But I think just to maybe go back to the question of data, I think that's a very important point today, because on the one way we see an exponential growth in the volume of data, and maybe that's one of the key differences when we look at today's driving forces behind digital economy. David mentioned that technology has been around for a long time. Indeed, if you look at, for instance, AI, the term AI was coined in 1956. So what's different now is the volume of data and the means and the techniques we use to explore this data. So when we look at the regulations, again, there has been a growth among regulators to try to figure out where do we draw the line between balancing certain policy objectives like privacy, security, consumer protection, trust, in order to also cater for these potential concerns, but at the same time not to inhibit the innovation side of what this growing volume of data means. So really from a regulatory perspective, drawing this balance is an important way. But as we know, different countries have different balances. So what you see on the global scale is a growing heterogeneity of regulations. So regulators adopt different kinds of regulations, different interpretations. And what this means for businesses trying to operate across borders is that they will have to cater for all these different regulations that governments impose. For a business, if I was a business that I want to operate in multiple countries and I have to comply with all the different regulations without any interoperable regulatory mechanism to facilitate me from operating in new markets, that would necessarily lead to additional costs. And these costs can be relatively high depending on what kind of businesses you're doing. So we looked in our recent work, we looked at, for instance, services domestic regulations, which are typically behind the border regulations that affect anything from licensing to authorizations, the need for compliance with local regulations on those fronts. And we already see that differences among countries are very important. So for instance, compliance costs here could go very high, especially in digital intensive sectors. For instance, if we think about financial services, the costs of not complying with international best practice amounts to up to 20% of the trade costs that firms incur because countries are not adhering to international best practice. So leveling the regulatory landscape or creating interoperability among these different regulatory mechanisms is a very important way for businesses to benefit from this digitalization, from new technologies like AI, from the growing volume of data, and to minimize really the risk of undermining their global competitiveness.
Thank you, Janos. I think it's pretty clear that we've begun a conversation here that we don't have time to really fulfill. I'm sure David would like to probably come back on that, but we'll go first to Adam, seeing I put him on notice, and then I'll give everyone a last soundbite as I wind up. So Adam, I am interested in, how do you make the upskilling methodology? What's the business model? I mean, I have no idea you identified some skills gaps. We need more growth hackers apparently, and we need more UX designers. I have no idea what either of those even is. So, okay, if we're going to set up an ecosystem that delivers the kind of technical training and upskill needed, what are the key ingredients?
Yeah, thanks, Jane. It's a fascinating question. The most important aspect that we've seen is really to have a most aligned ecosystem as possible. So this really means the integration between the public stakeholders as well as private industry. And we've tried to quantify over the years the reasons why ecosystems have actually accelerated within this space. And we have found a few ecosystems that always come back to the important factor of having a keystone team. And I'm just going to actually share my screen here quickly. A keystone team, of what we've seen, has 4 integral aspects to it to align the ecosystem. One is about supporting the success of existing initiatives, so the cooperation aspect, the support within the ecosystem. The second is about commencing and kickstarting new initiatives and programs that are missing. So for example, in an ecosystem that there aren't particular skill sets and that there are gaps, this keystone organization has the mandate and the responsibility to align all the different stakeholders and build this out proactively. Connecting, it's a soft metric that usually goes under the radar, but is incredibly important. Local connectedness as well as global connectedness. So connecting all the different stakeholders and coordinating, aligning and fostering cooperation between organizations and programs. A few examples we've seen around the world that have had the greatest success over the years include Stockholm and Sting back in 2002. Helsinki Sauna Guys, which started just with 4 entrepreneurs and have started entities like Maria 01, the enormous tech hub within Helsinki, Slush, one of the largest tech conferences around the world. Amsterdam, Startup Amsterdam, which we went into a little bit of detail before. They took the model of Sting and really integrated more, taking leadership and building momentum specifically on gaps that there are within the ecosystem.
Adam,
Can
I come in and interrupt you, because I'll give you no more than another minute, but there are 2 questions in the chat. They're very relevant to what you're talking about. And one is, we don't even know what the jobs are tomorrow. Why are you even talking about specific skills that need to be taught today? And secondly, the skills for deep tech different from other tech. And there's also a third question there about the cost of upskilling. And so maybe as you finish you might take those questions into account. They're all good questions.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, thank you for the questions. I guess the first aspect is looking at what are the jobs of the future. And I mean, no one can really precisely know, but we can look at trends of which subsectors of technology, say particularly within deep tech, are having the largest amounts of investments in terms of number of investments and the amount of investments. This will give a pretty good indication of the subsectors of technologies that are going to be most prevalent in the future in terms of growth, therefore the particular job aspects and skill sets within these. So as we mentioned before, kind of advanced manufacturing and robotics, AI, ag tech and new food. And I mean, the last aspect in terms of quantifying the importance of these ecosystem keystone organizations, we've seen that entities like Stockholm, Helsinki, Amsterdam, as well as Waterloo, these keystone organizations create the most rapid growth in terms of dollar value, in terms of exits over the years. So this is in terms of ranking ecosystems over the years. So I mean, in terms of startup ecosystems, there are many, many factors to this, but the talent and the funding aspect we see are incredible aspects in terms of building sustainable startup ecosystems. So in the long term, these can provide those social inclusion benefits as well.
Okay, thank you. We're 5 minutes over time. So what I'm going to do is just give the last word to Aboitiz and ask David for, what's your takeaway here? What do we need to keep on the APEC agenda?
Well, as a takeaway, in fact, I will borrow the question that was asked in terms on the statement that we don't know what are the jobs for tomorrow, because this is actually a very reoccurring syntax with its own data. What's going to be the investment? How does transformation look like? And I don't know if this is reassuring or not reassuring, but the reality is that if you know what they are now, then it's not tomorrow anymore, it's today. What I'm trying to say is transformation, the definition of transformation is that it's obvious in hindsight. So that means as organization, as an approach, there needs to be an understanding that what we need to incorporate as part of our planning, as part of our projection, is a sense of a bit discomfort. And as a data scientist, I would say that if you don't have a bit of discomfort, you are not transforming by definition. And the second one is it's more about risk tolerance. Going back to what Janos was saying, is that essentially saying, well, what is within the boundaries that you're operating, the risk that you are willing to accommodate. And there's no right or wrong here. That's the key thing. But just the key element is that transformation by definition is obvious in hindsight.
Thank you very much. Well, I can assure you I have a high degree of discomfort even in listening to a data scientist. It's certainly taking me out of my comfort zone, and it's a great message to leave us all with, that change is constant and ongoing. It's not going to stop, and we've all got to get used to it. So look, thank you, all three of you, for marvelous contribution. We will be reflecting on all of that. I'm hoping that ABAC might put some of this on paper, some very valuable insights. Thank you to everyone.